Russia, since Vladimir Putin came to be the ruler, the president, then the prime minister, then the president again since the year 2000, Russia's been in the news a lot. And Russia and the West have always had a very difficult and stretched relationship. And there's mutual misunderstanding and suspicion and lack of trust between both sides of the fence, if you might call it that. And there's aggressive and overbearing tactics wielded by both sides to either control or subvert the other side. Now, we, as Athel mentioned tonight, we've brought up the topic of Russia and their apparent aggressiveness on the world stage, which has been in the news a lot over the last decade or even more. And the things that have been prominent in the media and the events that have actually taken place are as follows. So just a few points, I guess, from Russia's military activity over the last decade and more. So first of all, there was the Georgia conflict, which happened in 2008. And Russia engaged in a brief war with Georgia over, you might remember, South Ossetia, a place you'd probably never heard of before. I certainly hadn't until it was mentioned in the news right back then. And then following that, there's been, in 2014, an annexation of Crimea. And this followed a controversial referendum, and Russia came in and annexed that from Ukraine in 2014. And then following that, there was an incident with pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, and had alleged support from Russia. And that conflict has escalated, and now it's still going 10 years later. And there's been, thousands of deaths and ongoing instability in the region. It's an awful, awful situation. And then, just a year later, there was an intervention in Syria that Russia had, where they intervened militarily in the Syrian civil war to support the regime of the ruler of that country, of Syria. And this shifted the balance of power in the Middle East and in that conflict as well, and boosted Russia's position in the Middle East. So you've probably seen, just as the headlines are flicking up there, there's a whole range of different views and opinions that have been expressed in the media from all of those events from that time. And let's just have a look at some of the Western responses to these actions of Russia. And we're probably familiar with some of them because we live in a Western country and the media is very heavily biased towards the West, unsurprisingly. So, of course, as you'd imagine, the relationship became further strained with the conflict in Georgia in 2008. And Western countries viewed these incursions into other countries as international law violations and, breaches of sovereignty of nations. And of course, they issued sanctions, which means they restricted Russia's operations in key sectors, in their economic sectors and finance and energy and defence. And we're told it was with the aim of pressuring Russia into changing their behaviour. And then, of course, there was NATO, an organisation of countries that expanded into Eastern Europe, pushing into Russia's border to, supposedly in response to Russia's perceived aggression. And there's military exercises and troops deployed, and then there's establishment of bases and defensive systems with missile capabilities. All of these things have been rolled out as Russia takes a more active role in the nations around its borders. And, the West has done all sorts of things. They've, restricted diplomatic travel. They've pulled their own diplomats back from Russia and expelled Russian diplomats from their own countries. They've accused Russia of civil rights breaches and of, suppression of the media, and so on. But something perhaps we may not be encouraged to consider, or maybe haven't even considered ourselves, is what is Russia's perspective on all this? And there's been a really interesting recent interview done with a prominent American figure and Vladimir Putin, very recently in fact, and it just shows that there is another perspective on things, and it's good to understand where people are coming from. So what's Russia's perception of this whole situation, both their own actions and the actions of the West and the responses? So we may not agree with Russia's point of view here. We might not even believe the things that they say, but they are opinions nonetheless, aren't they? And they're worth listening to. So from a historical context, when Russia moved into Georgia and then later into Crimea, they claim it's because of the perceived Western threats and agitations that were happening as NATO strengthened their defences on the borders of Russia. When they annexed Crimea, they say that there was a referendum held, which is controversial according to some reports at the very least. A referendum held, and it was supposedly supported by the majority before they moved into Crimea. And, of course, they talk about legitimate security concerns in their actions, and they're protecting their national interests. None of these things, I guess, are surprising. But I guess if you were to consider if it was America who had another foreign nation on their borders, would they act any differently? We don't want to excuse the actions of Russia tonight. We don't want to praise the actions of Russia or condemn or excuse or praise the actions of the West. We're really not here, as Athel mentioned before, to offer political commentary tonight. We are interested in world events. We're interested in the things that Russia does, the things that the West does. We're interested in all kinds of movements that happen throughout the world. But mainly from our community's point of view, we're interested in them because they align with Bible prophecy. And we also are interested in events which affect negatively people in the world. And, there's all sorts of hardships and horror that people go through when there's a war. And we can do very little as a small community of Bible believers in the face of such enormous tragedy, but we can pray, and we should pray, and we do pray for those who are going through hardship and loss. So we're going to talk about a couple of prophecies tonight in the Bible. I want to keep it really simple. We're going to limit ourselves to two, but there are a vast number of prophecies that we could talk about, which are very, very interesting. And we'll be dealing with more prophecies in the coming weeks if you're interested in attending then. But what I really want you to get from this particular slide and what I've been talking about so far is that from Russia's point of view, the West have behaved in ways that are demeaning, insulting, arrogant. They're met with frustration and suspicion. The West's actions give Russia the impression that they're not really interested in protecting Europe. They're more interested in constraining Russia's influence. And would we be shocked if there was some truth in that? I don't think so. And of course, we know what the West thinks of Russia, because that's almost exclusively the side that we're told by the media that we have here. So there's really this stalemate, this difficult situation. There's a measure of truth in both sides of the debate, and there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of suppression of information, a lot of outright lies on both sides of the debate as well. And I think we all know what the common factor is here. It's the same common factor that all of us have here. It's because we're human beings and we have human nature. And I think we all know what human nature is capable of, don't we? Maybe we like to think we're better than others in the sense that we wouldn't stoop to the depths that some people do. But I think if we're honest with ourselves and if we look deep within, we know that these problems are essentially unsolvable because both sides have valid points of view and it seems almost impossible to solve these issues. Sounds like a pretty cynical view of human nature, doesn't it? But and you might think that perhaps living here in the West, in Australia, in this comfortable, somewhat lucky country, that we're blessed with a form of peace. And I think when we think of peace, we mean no one's actually killing anyone else at the moment in a war in our country at the moment. But that's a fairly lame view of peace, isn't it? And we're going to have a look tonight at what the Bible thinks of peace and what the Bible teaches about peace, at least a very concise summary of it, because we don't have the time to go into huge detail. But even in the face of peace, as we might call it, there's almost certainly going to continue to be wars and invasions and destabilisation, lying and manipulation and all kinds of things across both sides of the fence to try and get one up on the other side. An interesting little thought activity to see how deeply the issues really are. Just try to imagine that you read the news tomorrow, you open the paper or you flick up a news article and it says, America backs down. And you read through and it says, America apologised overnight to Russia and promised for the good of Russia that they're no longer going to interfere with Russia anymore. And they pull out all their troops out of Europe. They apologise, they say we're sorry, and for the good of Russia, we're going to pull right back and scale back our operations. I can see some people are laughing because it's ridiculous. America wouldn't even as a nation think there's anything to apologise for. They're just protecting their national political interests. And if we read an article that said Russia apologises to the world, pulls back their troops out of the Ukraine and relinquishes the territory that they've claimed. Again, Russia doesn't think as if they've done anything wrong. When they get slapped with sanctions, they're not interpreted as a message for them to change their ways. They're an inconvenience and a frustration, and they affirm to them that the West is really just trying to slow them down and make things difficult for them as a country. So there doesn't seem to be any real solution to this issue and all of the other issues that are raging in the world right now. And there's many issues, many more issues that we could draw on, as Athel mentioned before. Israel and Palestine, Palestinians for one. So let's just change tack for a moment, well, from now on, and let's talk about some Bible prophecy. Now, the Bible is full of many prophecies, as we mentioned before, and there's a lot of prophecies in the Bible that have already been fulfilled. And there's lots that still haven't been fulfilled, but they've been recorded and they await fulfillment. So what if I said to you that the prophecies that we have that have been fulfilled in the Bible meet very high criteria that any reasonable person might expect if they wanted to validate whether a prophecy really is a prophecy that was, given by God or fake. And when I say valid and high criteria, there's prophecies that we have which are very specific. They specifically lay out predictions that are going to happen. The predictions are incredibly unlikely to just naturally happen. They're written long before they actually happened, and then they're fulfilled very accurately. And you can confirm that those things actually happened with external evidence, not just relying on the Bible as proof in some cases. So to me, some of those Bible passages are prophecies that any reasonable person would accept as legitimate. And that means that there is a God who wrote the Bible, and this book is a message that we can trust. There's a whole other raft of reasons why I and many members who are here believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We can't go into those tonight, but if you just allow yourself to entertain the possibility that the messages in the Bible, the prophecies in particular, are legitimate, let's just have a look at one amazing prophecy tonight, which specifically mentions Russia, the nation. And that prophecy is Ezekiel chapter 38. So we're not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail. We just don't have the time tonight. We want to keep things concise and keep you interested and engaged. So, but if you have a Bible, feel free to turn up Ezekiel chapter 38 and follow along as we have a look at what this remarkable chapter predicts is going to happen in the future. And as Athel mentioned, he sort of stole some of my thunder, but that's okay because we did talk about this before and I said it's all right. This is going to be, according to the Bible, this is an event that's going to change the world as we know it. It is going to be so dramatic that everyone at the end of it all is going to know who God is, they're going to know his name, and they're going to know that he is in control and always has been. That's big. All right, so this focuses on an enormous battle that's going to take place. So what's the timing of the chapter? If you just have a look in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, you'll see that it mentions that it's going to happen after many days in the latter years. It's going to happen a long time after Ezekiel writes. Now, Ezekiel is writing in around about 580 BC when the Babylonians had taken the Jewish people into captivity in Babylon. So it's a long time ago. And it's interesting what it records here in verse 8. So there's some more detail given. It says, in the latter years, you will come into the land. And we learn later on that it's the land of Israel, in the same verse actually, the mountains of Israel. So it's a land that's been brought back from the sword with people in it who've been gathered on the mountains of Israel from many people. So they've come out of many people. And those mountains of Israel were long desolate, and they were brought out of the nations, and now they dwell safely. So it's interesting because part of this prophecy, although it's set in a time that hasn't quite happened yet, this verse 8 here has actually been fulfilled in the lifetime of some of the older people who are here or might be listening. 100 years ago, you couldn't have said that this verse applied to the land of Israel, but you can now. You absolutely can now. Because there are people living in that land who've come out of all nations. They're living in the mountains of Israel, and they dwell in relative security and safety, certainly compared to what they've had in the past. And maybe there'll be some events in the recent future which render them even more safe. We don't know yet. It says in verse 11 that they're living in a land of unwalled villages, a peaceful people who dwell safely without walls and having neither bars nor gates. So there's a situation of peace, relative peace, and security. So that's interesting, isn't it? Part of this prophecy has already been fulfilled. And in a very, very, very short sliver of time relative to the history of the world. Certainly from the time when Ezekiel wrote right through to now, you couldn't have said that those verses have been fulfilled. And we're talking 2,500 plus years. And this little sliver in the last 100 years, these verses are falling into place. It's remarkable. So what else do we learn from this chapter? There's lots of detail in Ezekiel 38, and it mentions lots of events and lots of nations that come down into the land of Israel. And these nations are referred to by the names that they were known by in the days of Ezekiel in 580 BC. So you can't just go to your local, you can't pull it up on Google Maps and find out where Magog is or, Gomer or Togarmah or whatever. They're not called that anymore. But thankfully, there's lots of people who have looked into this stuff And again, as I said before, we're breezing through this. Unfortunately, we could spend more time on this, and we do in other nights. But for now, there's a number of these nations are mentioned. So there's Magog, which generally refers to an area north of the Black Sea. Now, in the New King James Version I have here, in verse 2, there's Magog, as I mentioned, and then it says, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And Rosh is commonly understood to be the medieval Rus people who are ancestors of the modern Russians. So all these other nations that this speaks of are aligning themselves with this leader who's called Gog of the land of Magog or Magog, and he is going to lead them all into Israel. There'll be a battle against Israel. So if you read this 100 years ago, Israel wasn't in the land at all. There was no, nation of Israel as it's called today. But there is now. So 100 years ago, this was a far-fetched chapter, but it's not anymore. And there's been plenty of events in recent history that agitate nations, and perhaps some of them would love nothing more than to invade and put a stop to this horrible unrest that's going on in that little tiny dot of a country. Let's see if I can get my mouse up. I don't know if that's coming up there. No, it's not. Pointer. There it is, Israel. Tiny little country relative to all the other nations there. But it causes so much trouble, doesn't it? So many problems and issues and situations that happen that cause the world to focus on that little sliver of land there. So I'm just going to make it simple for you and boil it down to these nations here in a nice benign purple colour. Typically we might colour it in red because, Russia's the bad guy, but everyone's a bad guy here. So these nations here are all mentioned, and curiously, when I snipped this off Google Maps, Libya wasn't named. I don't know why. And apologies to anyone that might be living in this region here. My tracing of the line was a bit squiggly. I've left out a few bits and included bits that may or may not be there. But this is the general idea. We've got an enormous group of people headed up by a leader, and they're all going to funnel down from the north and up from the south into the land of Israel. Now, partway through the chapter, in verse 13, there's a mention of another group of nations who are called Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions. Now, Tarshish is an interesting nation, if you like. It's a trade nation that kind of seemed to move around with the hub and centre of the trade empires as it moved around. So historically, it's been in locations like Carthage, but in more recent history, it's talking about people that rule the seas, that trade in wealth. And in recent times, that's been Britain or the United States, perhaps today. I believe it's talking about Western powers, particularly the Commonwealth nations, and they're going to oppose, if you can imagine, a group of nations coming down to attack Israel. Naturally, there's going to be some resistance. And these nations here in verse 13, Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, we can at least identify who Sheba and Dedan were. The areas of Saudi Arabia and Yemen down here. And I'm suggesting the United Kingdom plus a bunch of Commonwealth nations which are not on the map. Think bigger. They're all going to come up and say, what's going on here? As these nations charge into Israel. It kind of suggests that they've got a stake in the land, they're interested, but they're not involved with the group of people that are coming into Israel. So it says in verse 16 that this group of nations is unstoppable. They'll come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. They're going to come in like a storm, a massive number of troops. They'll be absolutely unstoppable. But then, remarkably, at the end of this chapter and flowing through into the next chapter, there's record of nothing else than a divine intervention. God is going to respond with an absolutely massive earthquake that's going to shake the whole earth. It's recorded there in verse 19. In that day there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, and it goes and records the magnitude of that earthquake. It's going to shake every living thing. Everyone will realise in that day that Yahweh is God. Yahweh being the name of God. So there's that quote there at the end of this chapter, which talks about the final consequence of this invasion and then a smashing by God himself through an earthquake and through other natural disasters and through the panic that will follow. Just the final result. It'll be obvious to everyone that Yahweh is the one who's in control. The Jews, the Israelis, the nations who are gathered there will all realise in that day that I am the Lord, or I am Yahweh. So there's another prophecy which we're not going to refer to in any detail tonight, but it talks about the same events and it gives a slightly different perspective on it. It's in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, and I'm just going to read it out. It's set at the same time, the end of the kingdom of men, if you like, and it says, in those days, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It's not going to pass away like every other nation that's come and gone. It'll stand forever, as it says at the end of that verse. It's going to break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end. So, can you imagine a more shocking and devastating and enormous upheaval that something like this would cause? The Bible's had these words recorded for us to read, recorded for people to read for 2,500 years, and they're still awaiting fulfillment. There's many prophecies that we could turn to that would affirm that God, when he speaks, it happens. So if something like this happens, which the Bible adamantly claims that it will, it's going to be a significant transformation to the world as we know it. So it's all been a bit doom and gloom and negative so far, hasn't it? But our title mentions world peace and God's plans for it. And he does have a plan for world peace. But world peace can't come without significant events in the earth. But we're told here that this significant event is going to be the point where things start to turn. When God intervenes, things will start to change. So who knows what that picture is there? What it's of? Does anyone know? I'm sure someone knows. Some people might have even actually gone and seen it. That's right. So there's a building in New York, the UN headquarters, and out the front of it, or I actually haven't been there, but nearby, there is a statue of a man here. And what's he doing? Does anyone know? He's got a hammer in one hand and what looks like a sword that's kind of bent in the other. What's he doing? He's beating a sword into a plowshare. So here's the quote that is associated with this statue out the front of the UN headquarters. They shall beat their swords into plowshares. A plowshare is an ancient agricultural instrument, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. What a wonderful thought. And it's out the front of the UN headquarters, and I think it resonates with that organisation. Wouldn't they love to say that we did this? We brought this to pass. We ended world wars all over the world. We stopped war forever. Thanks to us, thanks to our intervention. But the interesting thing is, that verse is actually cherry-picked. The first part of it's left off because this is a quote straight out of the Bible, And the Bible, in that passage, tells you how that's going to come to pass. But it's not mentioned here because I guess human nature wants the benefits without the method. They want to shortcut the pain to get to the glory. And the UN's been trying for 79 years to fulfill this quote themselves. And how are they going? Russia and America are both members of the UN. But here we are. We're still at a stalemate, aren't we? All these years later, 79 years later, there's something else ironic about this statue. Does anyone know who it was donated by? Yeah, it was donated by the USSR in 1959. An artist made the statue. It's a bronze statue. Russia, or the USSR, as it was then, donated this statue to the UN as kind of like an aspiration. This is where we'd love to be. They haven't done very well, have they, in the 80 years of the UN? Well, one day the Bible says this is going to be a reality. It's not mincing its words here and saying maybe if you're really good and we all put our heads together, we'll be able to achieve this. Look at the definiteness of the words. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn more anymore. We're going to have a bit more of a think about that in a moment, but let's, for now, have a reading of Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, which is where, so these words are in Isaiah chapter 2, and they're re-quoted again in Micah chapter 4. And we're going to read from the other section of Scripture, not Isaiah, but the Micah one. So we'll get Athel to come up and read that for us.
He's got better eyes than I have, the print's pretty small. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all people walk each in the name of his God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever.
Thanks, Athel. So did you see the quote? Did you see the words there? It's partway through verse 3, isn't it? And did you see what's deliberately left off? The way that this is going to be achieved in the earth. Someone is referred to, and that someone bears God's name. That someone represents God on earth and speaks God's words and has wisdom and is able to solve the problems of strong nations. Is able to rebuke them and tell them off and silence them and judge and discern problems and solve ancient problems that have never been able to be solved. This is a picture of world peace. So let's just think about those words that are up there on the screen, and also remembering that that there's a way that this is going to happen, and we've looked at how it's going to start to take place in Ezekiel 38 and in God's intervention, and then in the establishment of someone who's going to judge and rule. But just think about those words, because this is the picture that the Bible paints of the type of peace that the world is looking forward to. First of all, these words transcend the Bible in the sense that they've been used in all kinds of speeches, motivational speeches, and even interfaith talks where people of different religions that don't even believe the Bible, they aspire to these words as well. They resonate with people. People would love for that to happen. But no one knows the way. No one can do it. But how on earth could this happen? This is a picture of a world that doesn't spend a cent on war anymore. Now, defence budgets for countries, almost all countries in the world, would be spending billions, and in the case of the US, trillions of dollars, pouring into the war machine bucket every year to keep it going. So when I said everyone would love this to happen, everyone except the defence industry, because they make a lot of money. But everyone else, the average person, would love this to happen. No more war. But for this to happen, for every nation to no longer spend another cent on war, to no longer train and perform military exercises, and to actually transform their rusting military hardware into agricultural instruments so they can grow more food, what kind of a world is that? A world where nation never lifts up sword against nation. There's no more fighting at all. There's no more international problems. They've all been solved. Today, every nation's spending money on defence, and some nations don't use their weapons in war, but everyone's got to have them. Because if you don't, well, another nation can come on in and take what they want without resistance. So if everyone except one nation decided to turn their weapons into agricultural instruments, then that one nation is a wolf with teeth in a flock of sheep. Have a field day and take over the world. But this world has no war at all. There's no one like that. It's a very different world, isn't it? A very different world to the world we're in today. This is not just no more fighting and people killing each other openly. This goes right down deep to the very essence of the society that this world is all about. So let's think a little bit about peace from the Bible's perspective. Peace, unsurprisingly in the Bible, is not talking about not killing people and not fighting. Peace is actually a quality, it's a characteristic, it's a fruit that comes from God. It's a gift, if you like. So the Bible, as you may know, paints a picture of the beginning of the world. And we're not going to turn it up. It's the very first chapter of the Bible, the first couple of chapters. They talk about the creation story. They talk about a garden, a perfect, beautiful garden, and the first man and the woman, Adam and Eve, who were placed in that garden to look after it. And God's intention has always been for humanity to take the beauty of God's garden and fill the earth with it, spreading it by multiplying and taking God's name and God's character, God's image that the man and the woman are designed to display, take that throughout the earth. And in the beginning, there was actually peace. There was peace in the beginning there in that garden. It was kind of like a prototype of the final destination of the world. It's always been God's purpose, and it still is, to have a world at peace. And we could look to those chapters in the Bible for inspiration, where Adam and Eve and God walked together and talked together. There was harmony. There was cooperation and joy and peace, real peace, the biblical version of peace. There was even harmony with the garden, with the trees and with the earth and with the animals. Everything was at peace. But from those very early days, human nature has been a continual problem. God's still got that final plan for world peace, true peace, but the plan that God has was greater than just Adam and Eve in the garden. The plan involves salvation from human nature, deliverance from ourselves, our greatest enemy, the very cause of the problem. And that has to be taken away for something like these words to be fulfilled. So for them to be fulfilled and not just a fairy tale, a fanciful dream, something lovely that might happen one day, or we'd love to happen but never will, for these words to happen, things have got to change. Because peace is firstly about peace with God. And humanity has been estranged from God because of sin from the very earliest of times. There's always been a problem. And the Bible teaches, and there's so many quotes we could use, but I'm going to keep it really simple and just use one. The Bible teaches that we can have peace with God through the Lord Jesus Christ. There's that quote there, that beautiful quote in Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. The Bible teaches that we can be part of God's family when we're baptized into Jesus Christ. We can share in the benefits of being part of the family of God. And the benefits are forgiveness, of healing, of reconciliation, which is a big word that really means to be right with God, to be at peace with Him. And the benefits are love and fellowship and joy and, of course, peace. Peace with God and peace with ourselves. And peace is a gift from God for those who are reconciled to Him. We can enjoy the peace of God now. And it's because we've been cleansed and purified from sin, and shame and guilt is banished for those who are part of God's family. And sadly, we don't always get it right as part of God's family. Sometimes we still hold on to guilt and shame and pain and sin, even though we're part of His family. But forgiveness is always there for us. And peace is something that God is holding out and offering to all of us if we turn to Him and be part of His family. He's the author of peace. And it starts small in the heart of believers. But as these verses and the other verses we've looked at tonight show, God has global intentions. He's taking that peace to the whole earth. And maybe it's time now to put up the full quote on the screen, because that's how He's going to do it, isn't it? He's going to install a ruler who isn't subject to human nature with all its weakness, with all its corruptibility. He's going to install the same man who brings peace to individuals on that throne so that it can enjoy peace as well. And that man is the Lord Jesus Christ. And the Bible has so many quotes that we could use to talk about the kingdom of God on earth. This is what the Bible's one of its main themes, and we're not going to do it tonight. We just don't have the time. But that kingdom is going to be an amazing place. It's not just a fairy tale, but things have got to change dramatically for it to be fulfilled. As we've already seen, the nations and their resistance and their destructive intentions are going to be stopped, smashed, if you like, as other verses in the Bible describe it. And then God's kingdom is going to be established with a ruler like the world has never seen before. So that's the way peace is going to come. That's the Bible's story. He's first going to establish that righteous ruler, the one who is like God. in his character, in his mind, and in his heart. And his judgments, as it says there on the screen, he's going to judge between many people and he'll decide disputes for strong nations far away. He'll settle the problems once and for all. And without human nature binding him, he'll be unable to be corrupted or deceived. He's absolutely pure. He's absolutely fair. He's absolutely just. You can trust everything he says. If only there were a politician like that in the earth today. But there isn't, is there? Because they've all got human nature. So perhaps the things that the world longs for, deep down they long for, perhaps those things are within reach, but not with our own strength. The Bible is certainly clear that one day this is happening. One day there really will be true and lasting peace. So I guess I just wanted to close by asking a question. Are you afraid of the state of the world? Are you afraid of the way things are going? Do you feel like there's something really big? It just feels like something big is about to happen. Like you're almost standing on the edge of a cliff and the whole world's poised. Something's got to give. Things are getting worse, aren't they? Well, there's many prophecies in the Bible that tell us, that reassure us that God is actually in control, despite how crazy and out of control it might look. But you might be right about the big event that's about to happen, because the Bible is very clear on that too. There is something big that's about to happen. But you could have peace in your heart and become part of the family of God today, despite what's going on in the world around us. Because knowing that God is in control is incredibly reassuring. And God is in control. The Bible's clear on it. And soon the world is going to meet its destiny. And the kingdom of God and true world peace will be here forever.